So, welcome everybody to the Police Foundation Friday Exchange. I'm so sorry about the technical issues there. For some reason, we were just, John was sort of stuck in a kind of liminal space. We couldn't sort of extract him. So we're now, so we just had a few technical issues, but we are now here. And this is just like a regular Teams meeting. If you haven't been to these things before, basically this is a conversation that we're having with John and myself. And if you've got comments or questions you want to put to John throughout the course of the conversation, please put them in the chat function and I will pick ones out to ask as we go along. We are recording this and it will be on our YouTube channel, so do bear that in mind when you're framing your questions and so on. But without further ado, it's fantastic to welcome John Sutherland. Just a reminder, if anyone's, could everyone mute themselves just so we don't have any interruptions, just in case we get any background noise. But thank you so much, John, for making the time to talk to us today. I mean, John doesn't really need much of an introduction. Author, commentator, former chief superintendent in the Met, and I think has become, famous throughout the kind of policing world and beyond, particularly since he left policing, because of the number of fantastic books, both fiction and non-fiction, that he's been writing. But someone who's extremely knowledgeable and reflective about the state of policing, and we thought it'd be fantastic to have him here for a conversation. So welcome, John.
You're very kind. I'm not remotely famous for anything, but it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. And I thought it'd be great at the start, just for people. I mean, many people will have, read your books and know a bit about you, but I just wonder if you could say a bit about your background and perhaps sort of how you ended up joining the police and your sort of journey through policing up to where you are now. Just give us a bit of a taste of your story. That would be great.
Well, you're kind to ask. I'll endeavour to keep it brief. So, John Sutherland, I'm about 10 days short of my 55th birthday. I often say to people, I'm a husband to one, a dad to 3 daughters, and a proud resident of South London. And for more than 25 years, it was my extraordinary privilege to serve as an officer in the Met. I joined in September 1992. And I remember vividly the first moment it occurred to me that was what I wanted to do with my life. I must have been about 1986, 87. I was standing on Hammersmith Broadway, waiting for a bus to school, being too lazy to walk across the bridge. And I saw a PC walking down the pavement on the other side of the road. And he wasn't doing anything. He wasn't paying any attention to me. Knowing what I know now, he was just probably bored, cold, tired and hungry, on his way into Hammersmith Nick for a 999 breakfast. So there was nothing remarkable about the scene. In fact, it was entirely unremarkable. But the only way I've ever been able to explain it is to say that something just went click inside of me. I wouldn't want to give it kind of the full Damascus Road treatment. It wasn't quite that dramatic, but absolutely it was a moment in time. And from that moment onwards, it never seriously occurred to me to do anything else. It's the only job I ever applied for, only ever interview I ever went for, only thing I ever wanted to do with my life. And for more than 25 years, it was my duty and my joy. I loved almost every single passing minute of it. But anyone who knows anything about policing knows that it's not only the best job in the world, but it's also a heck of a job. And over time, it can take its toll. And in early 2013, I had what can only really be described as a massive nervous breakdown. And I ended up being off work for more than 7 months, having barely missed a day in my career up to that point in time. And although I made it back to work eventually, I never made it back to full operational duties. And that's why in 2018, I was medically retired. I think somebody might have muted me there.
Sorry,
That's right. I think I'm back on.
Yes, you are.
And that's how I ended up writing. It's not something I'd ever planned or intended. But whilst I was off sick, not well enough to return to work, but knowing that I was getting there, I just sat down in the same room that I'm sitting in now for about 10 or 15 minutes every day, because that's as much as I could manage. And I just started to write. And as much as anything, it was a means of just getting my brain working again, because it had almost completely shut down. But what I discovered, which is what so many people discover, is that it's enormously cathartic. And not only that I loved it. And so my life took this entirely unexpected turn, and I ended up as a retired police officer and an author, living life out of both choice and necessity, a lot more quietly and gently these days. But I'll hand back over to you in a sec. But that old phrase, you can take the copper out of the job, but it's a whole lot harder to take the job out of the copper. And I love it just as much as I ever did. And in my own fairly small, limited way, I still try to support in any way that I can.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, John. A great sort of walk through your story. Actually, could you say you say you loved it? Could you say something about why you loved it? What is it about policing that motivated you and that it meant that you enjoyed the job so much for the majority of the time while you were doing it? What is it about policing that really worked for you?
I mean, my answer to that will be very familiar to what I expect everyone on this call, because I think it's probably true of every good copper that any of us ever worked with. I mean, in the end, for me, it was simply about making a difference. Yeah. I spent a number of years as a hostage and crisis negotiator, which was one of the greatest privileges of all. And there's a guy called Phil Williams, some of you may remember him. He's the former head of the hostage unit, now retired. But when he used to call one of us up to go out to a negotiation job, the phone would ring and you'd see from your call display that it was Phil. But as you connected, he never said hello. He never asked how you were. He never apologized for disturbing you. There was no small talk at all. There was just his voice at the other end of the line saying, "Are you ready to save a life?" And it's a slight affectation perhaps, but it still makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up on end. Because the greatest duty, the greatest privilege that any of us, but police officers in particular, could ever have is to save the life of another human being. And so it's that, and every possible variation of that lit a fire inside me that still hasn't gone out.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, you spent a lot of your career, I know, dealing with issues around violent crime, and obviously this is something which is always a big focus for policing, for public life, the media, and so on. And I know that the government's two of the government's big objectives in terms of crime are around reducing knife crime and reducing violence against women and girls. And I just wondered if we could start with those areas, and if you could give us some of your reflections on what you think needs to be done actually to tackle the issues around violent crime, whether that be around domestic abuse, whether it be knife crime, whichever aspect you want to talk about.
Well, I could probably go non-stop for about the next 7 days on those subjects. So again, I will do very best to be really brief. I'll start with a brief comment on domestic violence, and then give you a little bit more detail around knife crime. And actually, many of the themes are sort of interlocking, interchangeable. My view on domestic violence is unequivocally clear. And I've said this and I've written this publicly on a number of occasions and in a number of different places. But my view is that domestic violence is a disease of pandemic proportions. It is a form of terrorism that is, and I don't use that word lightly, I use it very intentionally. It's the single greatest cause of harm in society. And actually, and we can get into this in more detail if you want to, if people are interested, but it's actually ultimately one of the most significant drivers of every other kind of violence in society, including knife crime. And on the subject of knife crime, I mean, I had my head in my hands again last week when the current government announced their big campaign around trying to limit online sales of knives. And in an attempt to be sort of pithy, I just retweeted the government announcement, and my only comment was that it was the wrong answer to the wrong question. And what we so often find with governments of every colour is they default to short-term quick fixes that aren't going to cost them very much money. So often you'll find that the first response from a politician to a high-profile crime problem is to suggest the need for some form of new legislation or regulation. And the reasons they do that, candidly, is because it gives the appearance of doing something, whilst in fact achieving almost nothing of any significance or sustainable impact. And so again, I've said and written on knife crime. I'll give you in 12 seconds flat my 5-point plan for knife crime. It's got to be long term, and by long term I mean 20 years plus. Yeah. It's got to be based on and sustained on a public health approach that recognises violence as a disease that can be caught and transmitted, but equally that can be diagnosed and treated. Third thing is that it's got to be operationally independent from political control. As soon as politicians get involved, it becomes short-termist. It becomes limited by the election cycle and the funding cycles that go with it. And when you're dealing with problems that have been a generation or more in the making, none of them are going to be fixed overnight. None of them are going to be fixed before the next trip to the polls. So it's got to be independent of politics. You know, towards the end of my career and in the early days of my retirement, we had this I was going to say farcical, but it's much worse than that, situation where you had a Labour-run City Hall in London and a Conservative-run Home Office, both saying things about knife crime, but both flat refusing to work with one another to do the things that needed to be done. I mean, even as I talk about it now, I feel angry. So got to be operationally independent from political control. Fourth thing, though, this may be less expected from me, I don't think police officers should be in charge of it either. I think policing absolutely needs to be at the heart of the response, but not at the head, if you want it put in simple terms. So policing has an absolutely critical role to play, particularly in the first response. But again, if you put police officers in charge, the tendency is towards enforcement-led approaches, which are not the long-term solution to anything. And then the fifth part of the plan, so point 1, long-term, point 2, public health approach, point 3, independent of politics, point 4, policing at the heart but not the head, and then point 5, an approach that recognises young people actually as part of the solution, rather than just defining them as the problem. So as I say, I could talk for 7 days about it, but those would be my headlines.
That's fantastic. A brilliant manifesto for trying to tackle a difficult problem. We've actually got a related question from Claire, who's put something in on domestic violence, saying, interesting news article today about a pilot project with some forces putting domestic violence experts in control rooms. As an old comms operator from many years ago, I have my reservations. Do you have any thoughts on this? So DV experts in control rooms.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know what Claire's specific reservations are. I mean, I'm instinctively, I would probably share them, but I'm not sure exactly what she has in mind. I mean, again, there's a little bit of kind of bolting horses and stable doors. By the time the call has come into the control room, it's already too late. Society has already failed, because we know from long-standing research that domestic violence and abuse victims may well be targeted on 30 plus occasions before the police are ever first notified. So yes, we should be doing everything we can as a police service to better respond to crimes in progress and people in crisis. But if we're actually serious about fixing it, we need to go way further back in time, to the reasons why the abuse is happening in the first place, and what the consequences of that abuse are, not just for the individual women, and it is mostly women, but also for any children who are caught up in it, but also for wider society.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if one thing that you mentioned there about politics, and I wonder if this is a way into this area, is what do you think about the relationship between politics and policing? And in particular, we've seen obviously some big reforms over the period in which you were still serving in the police, introduction of police and crime commissioners. We've obviously seen a succession of secretaries, often with quite different styles and approaches over that period. I just wondered if you could, what your view is about. There always has to be some relationship between politics and policing, because clearly the government funds the police have to be accountable to the public in various different ways, and so on. But what do you think about the way in which this has kind of manifested itself in recent years?
Again, I'll be blunt and candid, and I'm happily to be challenged and questioned. I think politics and policing are disastrous bedfellows. That is absolutely not an argument against, as you're saying, against transparency and accountability. I am for more of those things, not less. But all of my experience in my service and all of my observing in the period since my service, it is just of a catalogue of harm done by politicians to policing that will take generations to mend. So if I start with the sort of the Theresa May reforms, honestly, and again, if people are interested to read a slightly more, hopefully intelligent and detailed analysis, it's in my second book, Crossing the Line. But honestly, I think she got pretty much every single big call wrong, and catastrophically wrong. And part of the problem, or part of the reason for that, is that she didn't listen to the voices of experience. When people tried to warn her, she accused them of crying wolf. And so take PCCs as one of the very few things she introduced that hasn't since been done away with, because even her own successors in the Conservative Party realised that most of what she'd done was a disaster. I mean, I think with some very honourable individual exceptions, I'm talking about some individual PCs, and primarily those who weren't politically aligned, I think PCCs have been disastrous for policing. I think they've made policing short-termist, reactionary, and driven by things other than the greater public good, if I'm honest. But I don't entirely blame the politicians. There are two sides to every story. I think far too many senior policing leaders in recent years have allowed themselves to become compromised by politics. you and I were chatting earlier in the week. And this is a personal view, which I'm happy to be challenged on. But I think, for example, the Met's what I know. I think Sir Ian Blair, when he was commissioner, allowed himself to be far too closely aligned with New Labour and with Tony Blair. I think latterly, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, when he was commissioner, allowed himself to be far too closely aligned with Boris Johnson and Priti Patel. And one of the policing principles that I was raised on was the notion of operational independence from political control. And I think we've lost a huge amount of that, and that it's been to the detriment not just of policing but the communities we serve. So kind of looking ahead and trying to be hopeful rather than despairing. I think one of the things policing must do is at a senior leadership level rediscover the courage that comes with operational experience, but also rediscover the reason it is why all of the best of us joined in the first place. And it wasn't to play politics, it was to make places safer, it was to save people's lives. When I was borough commander at Camden, I'm just kind of a small example, and I'm not sure how much long-term difference it made, but to try and explain where I was coming from, I would say explicitly to my sort of management team at Camden, in relation to any significant decision or any decision that we take locally, there are 3 questions to be asked. Number 1, is it going to make Camden, in our case, safer? Number 2, is it going to improve the quality of service that we offer to the public? Number 3, is it going to make it easier for our own people, our officers and staff, to do their jobs? And the message was, if you can't answer yes to at least one of those questions, and preferably more, we shouldn't be going anywhere near it. But there's far too much gone on in recent years that has failed all 3 tests, and that's just unconscionable to me.
Yeah, we've got an interesting question from Giles Hurdell in the chat where he says, you have rightly, in my opinion, been critical of government interference and short-termism regarding policing, but issues like VORG and knife crime were not prioritised within or by policing in the past, even when there was much more money, despite the obvious harm they cause. What does that say about policing culture and priorities?
Yeah, no, Giles and I will agree on this, and I suspect many other issues as well. I mean, it's a little bit about what I've already said. It's policing that has allowed itself to become compromised by politics and by performance cultures. So, back in my time as borough commander, and others will have their own experiences of variations on this, we had what was called the basket of 10 crimes that had been set by Boris Johnson as mayor, and they were to be our focus. And there were 1 or 2 crimes in there that should have been in there, robbery and burglary, and some general violence measures. But there was nothing in there about domestic violence specifically. There was nothing in there about knife crime specifically. There was nothing in there about sexual offences at all, child abuse at all. I mean, it was an absolute dereliction of our duty to prevent harm, and yet the leadership of policing went along with it. And again, I've written this in the book, as a borough commander, I was far more likely to get a phone call from headquarters about a series of car break-ins than I was to get a phone call about a series of rapes. And how did we allow ourselves to get there? So when I moved from Camden to Southwark, so I took a sort of a level transfer from borough commander in one place to the other. Southwark was the worst place in the country for knife crime, worse than Glasgow, worse than some of the other places that are often held up, certainly historically, as problematic. And I, in effect, had to say to my team, we set the basket of 10 aside.
Right.
because we're going to concentrate on what we know needs doing locally. And so we put the overwhelming majority of our resources into youth violence, knife crime, and street robbery, because that's where people were being murdered and seriously injured. But I had to do that in spite of, rather than because of, the leadership and performance framework that existed.
Yeah, and
Maybe that's one of the reasons in the end why I broke.
right. And was that I mean, and how hard was that to do, John, in the sense of presumably you've got pressure on you around the basket of 10 in terms of your performance on that, and you're sort of saying, well, actually, that's not the most important set of things that are affecting people in my community. um,
Yeah.
yeah,
But what happens is when politicians take over and when senior leaders go with them, you disempower the people operating locally who
yeah,
know and understand what's really going on the street.
yeah,
Um, and it's, yeah, I mean, how many lives have we lost as a consequence of our failure to do the right thing?
yeah. Um, Let me just see. We've got another. It's more of a comment that we'll come back to, my colleague. I wanted to ask about there's a lot of talk about that there's a crisis of confidence in policing at the moment, that and we've definitely seen that. If you look at the surveys, levels of trust, levels of confidence and satisfaction in the police in London, but also across the country, have gone down in recent years. And I just wondered if you had thoughts on what's going on there, and what we need to do to respond to that.
So number one, absolutely, there is a crisis of confidence, but perhaps the worst of the modern era. And again, I'm sorry to be boring and talk about London, but that's what I know, and I know there will be similar experiences up and down the country. But there is an absolute crisis of confidence in the Met, particularly among London's black communities, London's female communities, and London's young communities, all of whom have suffered disproportionately as a consequence of serious crimes. So the first and one of the most important things we have to do is acknowledge the reality of it. There's no point denying that it's there. Second thing is we need to recognise that it is in significant part policing's own fault. I often say, particularly when I'm talking to journalists and others, I'm not a blind apologist for the job that I used to do. Policing sometimes, individually and collectively, gets things horribly wrong. And I think if you truly love an organisation, you need to be willing to acknowledge its faults. Again, I've said quite often recently, I don't think you can be a credible critic of bad policing without also being a vocal supporter of good policing. And the reverse is true. It's not either or, it has to be both. So those of us who truly love policing, and I count myself among them, have to be willing to acknowledge when we've got it wrong. And the Met in particular has got things horribly wrong in the last 5 or 6 years. So that's the first thing, is acknowledge the problem and our own culpability for it.
Yeah.
But then you've got to work out what to do about it. And so you need to understand what the sources, the causes of those grievances are, and then you need to do things to address them directly. So we shouldn't be mucking about with stuff that doesn't really matter. We should absolutely be prioritising crimes that affect the most vulnerable. And it's, one of John Stevens' old sayings, but that I've often repeated: everything can't be a priority, because if everything is, then nothing is. Every crime matters to every victim, rightly and understandably so. And I've been a victim of crime myself. I suspect most of us have. Of course, every crime matters to every victim. but not every crime is equal. So again, just reflecting on real life experience, as back at Camden as the borough commander there, I was at a public meeting with the leader of the council, kind of taking questions from the floor. This was the sort of the earlier days of austerity, just as it was beginning to bite. And one of the questions from the floor was from a fairly well-spoken man who was very upset because he'd had his bicycle stolen. And he didn't think the police had taken it seriously enough. And he wanted to know what I was going to do about it. Well, the first thing was that I apologized, that had been his experience and that he'd been a victim of crime in the first place. But then I said to him, I'm going to give you a really honest answer, which is probably not what you want to hear. And I explained the competing priorities that I had as a borough commander and the diminishing resources that were at my disposal. And, you know, domestic violence has to matter more than a bit of graffiti on the pub wall. Serious youth violence, knife crime has to matter more than the theft of a bike. Any crime that has a vulnerable adult or child as its victim has to matter more than one that doesn't. And I said to him, it's not that I don't care, quite the opposite. It's just that there are other things that have to matter more. And then I said, I'm sorry, that's probably not what you want to hear. And he really surprised me. He said, no, I want to thank you. But that's the first time anyone's given me a straight answer.
Yeah.
And I wonder sometimes whether we just need to do a better job of explaining ourselves. But policing has got to concentrate on what matters more, and not to be pulled off by the latest set of headlines in the Daily Mail or the Evening Standard or the latest load of garbage being spouted on social media. We got to have the courage of our professional commitments to say this here, domestic violence, knife crime, sexual offences, whatever it might be, that these are the things that matter and we're not moving from them.
Yeah. We've got a question from Derek who says, given recent events, how important is an efficient and continuous vetting process to build public trust and confidence in the police?
Brilliant question, Derek, and it's fundamental. And, you know, this is where we get back to, you know, I haven't used the austerity word yet, although it's been implicit in much of what I've said. You know, one of the direct consequences of austerity was less being invested in things like vetting and in training and in leadership development and in all the things that establish whether you or I or anyone else is suitable to hold the office of constable. You know, there is an urgent need to reinvest in policing at almost every level. And, you know, recruitment and training is one of the most fundamental elements of that. And the recent vetting debate, you know, is another one that was quite polarizing. And because I try to be constructive on social media and because I try to be polite even with people who disagree with me, I don't often get a lot of flack. Maybe that's just everyone else being kind, but on the whole, most of my social media interactions are fairly positive. But on the vetting question, I got a lot of pushback. And maybe that's because I didn't explain myself well enough. But also I think it is because we haven't all fully, truly understood what's at stake here. I am not for one moment or in any way advocating for the loss of due process when it comes to investigations into individual officers. But in the case of the sergeant whose circumstances were brought before the High Court by the Police Federation that made the news last week, I mean, my views on this could not be any more clear. A man who has been on the receiving end of multiple allegations of sexual impropriety from multiple sources should not be anywhere near policing. And it's not about establishing guilt or innocence to a civil, never mind criminal standard. It's about the fundamental suitability of an individual to perform one of the most essential roles in society. And as I wrote a piece about it for the Independent newspaper last week, you know, as recent agonizing experience tells us, this is not some kind of idle philosophical or even legal debate. It is quite literally a matter of life and death. And I don't know any other way of articulating that.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's critical for policing, isn't it? Because if police, you know, if you can't deal with those issues, then we come back to this issue of trust and confidence, which is the public thinks, well, you know, how can it be right?
And you know, a lot of the pushback to me, which I understand, is, you know, if you're going to use a vetting failure as a reason to dismiss, you're effectively asking for 3 bites of the cherry, because you're saying somebody either hasn't been convicted to a criminal standard or their case never got to court, and then they've not been found at a discipline board to the civil standard. So sacking them on vetting is a 3rd bite of the cherry. And yes and no. What you're establishing with the vetting is different to what you're establishing in either a court of law or on a discipline board. As I say, those are about guilt or innocence. The vetting question is a much more fundamental one about suitability to perform a role. And, you know, the pushback comes again, but, you know, what about malicious allegations? You know, what about the risk that an innocent person loses their career and their livelihood? And yeah, I think that's a very legitimate concern to raise. But I don't think that what's at stake here is John Sutherland likely to lose his job as a result of one uncorroborated allegation that may well be malicious. What we're talking about here is individuals where there would appear to be a pattern of behaviour that fundamentally calls into question whether they should be in the job.
Yeah, and it's also true that because police officers are not subject to employment law in the same way that, you know, say I am or my staff are in our organisation, in most organisations, they, you know, you don't need to meet a civil standard or a criminal standard to decide that someone isn't appropriate to work in an organisation. I mean, that's just, you know, and I think that's sometimes where policing gets into trouble, that people do things which in most organisations would be grounds for dismissal, but in policing the standard has always been higher, just because of the nature of the officer, constable, and so on. So it's a.
I'm not pretending that any of it is easy, but I do think this is a good example of an issue that we have got spectacularly wrong in the past, and that we clearly need to be bolder, braver in dealing with.
Yeah. Now, you talked about austerity, and you mentioned a bit about that, and your sort of latter period in the Met coincided with, you know, when austerity was really biting. And I just wondered what your views were on the impact of austerity as we've seen it on policing, and the impact that, you know, arguably kind of continues to this day.
One word: catastrophic. I'll talk about policing directly and indirectly. This is where I can sort of extend my gaze beyond the cosy confines of the capital. From 2010 to 2018, the government cut 44,000 officers and staff from policing in England and Wales, and that is a telephone number. But it wasn't only the numbers we lost, it was the experience we lost. And you learn policing by doing policing. And effective local neighbourhood community policing is all about the development of trusted relationships over long periods of time. And the government ripped the heart out of all of that. And, you know, as soon as Theresa May and David Cameron have gone, the Conservative governments that followed went into full reverse, you know, desperately scrabbling to re-recruit 20,000 officers nationally. And it's just been I think in impolite company, the phrase would be shit show. But I know this is a family gathering, so let's just call it a catastrophe. But it's not just the direct impact on policing. Of course, it's the indirect impact, first of austerity on the rest of the public sector, but also of austerity on society. So take the public sector. We all know that every other part of the public sector has been cut to the bone as well. And on far too many occasions, it's been police officers who've been left to pick up the pieces. Mental health is the example most often used, but it applies across the board to children's services, to adult social care, to youth offending services. The list goes on and on and on. Vulnerable people are falling through the gaps in every part of society. And we're asking already overloaded, overworked, and frequently inexperienced coppers to run around trying to catch them. So, policing hasn't only been hammered directly, it's been hammered indirectly as well. But then you look at wider society, and again, my sort of simple observation on this is that the cost of austerity has been greatest for those least able to bear it. And anyone with half a brain who spent more than half a second examining what lies at the heart of crime knows that in a huge proportion of cases, one of the principal drivers of criminality is poverty. And when you impoverish communities, you leave them more vulnerable, susceptible to crime. Austerity has been a catastrophe. And even in the last 24 hours, we've seen mention of the fact that the current Labour government may have to go back down the austerity road. Well, dear God, please don't let them repeat the mistakes of their predecessors.
And I think you mentioned earlier, and this is just we've just got a few minutes left, and I just thought it'd be good to reflect on your experience as a hostage negotiator, and you talked about that as one of the things that you enjoyed most from your time in policing. What is it about? What did you learn, or what did you take from that experience as a hostage negotiator?
Well, first and foremost, that greatest privilege I referred to earlier. Any day you get to play some small part in saving someone's life is the greatest day of all. So that's first and far and away the biggest thing. But the second thing is, I think some of the professional skills that you learn that have personal application for the whole of life. Sort of the casual passerby would be forgiven for thinking that hostage negotiators are selected on the basis of their ability to talk. And talking, of course, is incredibly important. And the consequences of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time don't bear thinking about. So absolutely talking matters. But the thing that matters significantly more is listening. And this is where I kind of, when we were chatting earlier this week, it's a fairly sober observation about the state of the world that we currently live in, that we are all, not all, but so many of us are just shouting at one another with our fingers in our ears, whether it's about politics or 1,000 other things besides. We've become enormously tribal. We've retreated to our trenches and our echo chambers, and we have lost the ability to listen to one another. And I think that's a profoundly dangerous thing. Because I learned time and time and time again over the course of my time as a hostage negotiator that actually listening saves lives. And the consequences of failing to listen, whether that's Theresa May and austerity, whether it's Trump and all good reason, or whether it's any of us with people we disagree with, there is a profound danger in failing to listen. but profound possibility in rediscovering the art.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I hope that something for us all to reflect on there. I think, and you're now an author. And one thing I should say, and I forgot to say at the start, is that John's very kindly offered to sign a copy of his first book, Blue, which we're going to put in a prize draw. So everyone who's on the call, my colleague Nicole is going to pick names out of a digital hat, and we'll make sure that a signed copy of the book is on its way to the lucky winner. And you've got what's your next book? Your new book that's coming out very soon, I think, John.
Oh, well, you're kind to ask. I'm not here to sell books, but yes. So the first two books I wrote were non-fiction, Blue and Crossing the Line, and they were specifically about my policing experience and then sort of the wider world and what policing tells us about it. In more recent times, I've been writing crime fiction, and I've been writing about hostage negotiators in particular. And the third one in my negotiator series is coming out in April, and it's called The Castle, and it's available for pre-order now.
Fantastic. Well, people will know where they can go and pre-order such things, so please go and do that. John, it's been fantastic to spend some time with you this afternoon. Lots of words of wisdom, which I know people will have taken a lot from on this call. So thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's fantastic. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this session. I should also say that do keep an eye on our social media feeds for future sessions. The next one is 28th of March. We'll be speaking to Lee Freeman, former Chief Constable of Humberside Police, who's going to be talking about his experience at Humberside, and he's now in the inspectorate as an HMI, and we'll be talking about his role there. So, and Nicole's very kindly put a link to John's book in the chat, so do click on that. But
what I will say is, if you click on the link and pre-order the book, my children will be able to eat tonight. That's all I'll say on that.
So no pressure. Fantastic. Well, thanks again, John. Thanks to you all, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers.